The first thing I noticed after I moved in was how proud the neighborhood was of being controlled. Not cared for, not maintained, not improved. Controlled. The entrance sign looked freshly polished every week. The flower beds were arranged like a showroom display, and every mailbox stood at the exact same height, like a row of soldiers. The houses were nice, sure, but the perfection felt less like comfort and more like surveillance. The kind of place where people didn't just wave hello. They counted how long your trash can stayed visible from the curb. I hadn't come here chasing perfection. I came because the property checked two boxes I couldn't ignore. The house itself was solid, and the land behind it was bigger than anything else in that neighborhood. It wasn't some flat little backyard boxed in by identical fences. My lot stretched past the tree line into a rough, half-wild strip that ended near an old drainage easement and a service road. It wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of land most people didn't want because it required work. But it felt like freedom. It felt like breathing room in a world that kept getting tighter. The realtor had called it a unique lot line with historical boundaries. He said it casually, like it was a fun trivia detail. The county record showed it clearly, the title paperwork matched, and the survey stakes were still buried where they had been for years. The back corner line jogged slightly outward before turning again, grabbing an extra wedge of wooded space that my neighbors didn't have. It wasn't stolen land, it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't ambiguous. It was simply old. Older than the HOA, older than the neighborhood's obsession with neat rectangles and uniformity. That detail mattered, because the HOA was the kind that needed the world to look simple, even when it wasn't. Their rules weren't just about grass height and paint color. Their rules were about authority, about reminding everyone constantly that there was always someone watching and someone willing to punish. The bylaws were thick, the enforcement notices were frequent, and the board members carried themselves like they'd been elected to run a small country instead of a suburban association. I kept my head down at first. I fixed a few things, cleaned up brush, and started planning for what I wanted the back acreage to become. A workshop, maybe, a small garden area, a place to store equipment without worrying about a neighbor peeking through blinds with a camera ready. Nothing dramatic, nothing that should have bothered anyone, but in a neighborhood like this, the moment you have something other people don't, it becomes their business. At first it was subtle. A neighbor walking their dog would slow down near the back tree line. Someone would stand on a deck just a little too long, staring toward my property. A drone buzzed overhead one afternoon and hovered long enough to make it clear it wasn't lost. When I looked up, it zipped away like a guilty thought. Then the letters started. They weren't official violations at first, just friendly reminders delivered on HOA letterhead with an oddly threatening cheerfulness. Reminders about brush piles, reminders about maintaining a consistent aesthetic, reminders about unauthorized modifications. I hadn't built anything. I hadn't changed anything visible from the street. I had simply cleared fallen limbs and started marking where I might place a shed far back from anyone's view. The letters kept arriving anyway, as if the HOA real job was to keep pressure on anyone who didn't fit the mold perfectly. I ignored most of them. I knew my rights, I paid my dues, and I wasn't interested in being trained like a dog to jump at every whistle. That's when the HOA president noticed me. In neighborhoods like this, the president is never just a volunteer. It's always someone who treats the position like a throne, someone who craves the feeling of being able to say no, someone who enjoys the power to make people apologize for existing. The president in this community had been in charge long enough that people spoke about him the way they spoke about weather. Like he was a force you couldn't argue with, just endure. I didn't meet him properly at first. I just became aware of him the way you become aware of a shadow behind you, the same car idling near the street when I was outside, the same figure at HOA meetings standing slightly taller than everyone else, letting silence stretch to prove he owned it. The same name at the bottom of every notice, and then, one Saturday morning, the conflict finally showed its real face. I was in the back clearing a narrow path through the trees when I heard movement from the far end near the service road. Not the soft movement of wildlife, not the random sound of a neighbor's mower. This was deliberate. Multiple footsteps. the heavy crunch of boots on dry leaves. Someone was coming onto my land without asking. I walked toward the sound and stopped near the boundary line where the brush thinned. Through the trees, I saw several people moving in a line, cutting through like they belonged there. One held a clipboard. Another carried a thick roll of something that looked like documents or plans, and leading them was a man whose posture screamed entitlement even from a distance. It was the HOA president. He didn't look like someone taking a casual walk. He looked like someone arriving to collect a debt. His clothes were neat, expensive in a bland way, and his expression was locked in that confident stiffness people get when they've spent years being obeyed. The others followed half a step behind him like assistants, not equals, not friends. They didn't call out to announce themselves. They didn't pause at the edge of my property to wait for permission. They kept walking as if the land was already theirs, and I was the one trespassing by being present. When they reached the area near the old stakes, they stopped and started gesturing. The clipboard man pointed toward the trees, tracing an imaginary line in the air. The roll of papers unfurled slightly, flashing the pale surface of a map. The HOA president stood with his hands on his hips, scanning the ground like he was measuring what he was about to take. I watched for a moment, letting it sink in. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't confusion. It was a claim. A quiet, confident claim being performed on my land, as if reality would bend just because the HOA president declared it should. I didn't rush out. I didn't shout. I didn't do anything that would give them the satisfaction of calling me unstable. Instead, I moved closer, staying behind trees until I was within clear sight and could see what they were doing. The clipboard man leaned down near one of the older markers. The president pointed again, this time farther out, toward the area where the lot line jogged. The group shifted, stepping deeper into my property, as if expanding their territory 1 foot at a time. That was when I noticed the detail that turned my stomach cold. One of them, standing slightly apart, watching the tree line instead of the ground, had something on his hip. Not a tool, not a phone, not a measuring tape. A holstered handgun. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden. It was positioned in a way that was meant to be seen. The message was loud even without words. This wasn't just paperwork and posturing. This was intimidation dressed up as procedure. In that moment, the neighborhood's polished entrance sign and pretty flower beds felt like a mask. Underneath, it was something uglier. People who believed rules could become weapons, and weapons could become authority. I stood there, feeling the weight of the situation settle onto my shoulders. An HOA president and his crew weren't just trespassing. They were acting like they were about to redraw my property line by force. And if they were willing to bring a gun to discuss land boundaries, they weren't planning a conversation. They were planning compliance. I backed away slowly, keeping myself hidden. My mind moved faster than my feet. I didn't need to prove they were wrong by arguing in the woods. I needed proof. I needed records. I needed the kind of evidence that didn't care how confident someone sounded. The kind of evidence that made county officials take notice. The kind of evidence that could turn a bully's performance into a public disaster. I headed for the house, already knowing I wasn't dealing with a simple HOA violation anymore. I was dealing with something that had been building for a long time, an obsession with control, a desire to own what wasn't theirs, and a president who had finally decided intimidation was easier than paperwork. And as I reached my back door, I glanced over my shoulder one more time and saw them moving again, pushing farther in, marking trees like they were preparing to cut them, behaving like the land had already changed hands. That was the moment I understood the real threat. If I didn't act fast, they weren't going to stop at pretending. They were going to start taking. The next step wasn't confrontation. The next step was exposure. And I already knew exactly where to begin. The folder from closing day, the county parcel map, the old survey that showed the jog in the line that made my lot unique, the proof they were hoping no one would ever look up. I went inside, locked the door, and pulled the documents from the drawer like I was loading ammunition of my own paper ammunition. the kind that could destroy someone without ever raising a weapon. Outside, the footsteps continued in the woods. Inside, I started preparing for a fight they didn't realize they were about to lose, and before the day was over, one phone call would set the first trap. I didn't rush back outside. That was the mistake people like him expected. They counted on emotion, on confrontation, on fear making someone slip up. I let the woods keep their secret while I stayed inside, calm on the surface and furious underneath. The house felt different now, not like a place of rest, but like a control room. Every drawer, every folder, every scrap of paper suddenly mattered. I spread the documents across the dining table the way investigators do in movies, but this wasn't drama. This was survival. The deed came first, crisp and unambiguous, stamped and recorded years before the HOA ever existed. My name sat exactly where it should. The legal description followed, dense with measurements and references that most people never read because they don't expect to be challenged. I read every line slowly, tracing the boundaries with my finger, confirming what I already knew. The jog in the lot line was there. Clear, intentional, not an error. Next came the survey. Older paper, faint ink, but still legible. The surveyor's notes described the markers, the distances, the reference points tied to permanent features that hadn't moved in decades. Creek bends, old fence remnants, the service road, the same land the HOA president was currently treating like an unlocked prize. I felt something close to relief, but it was sharp, not comforting. Proof was powerful, but only if it reached the right eyes. Outside, I could still hear movement. The sound wasn't frantic. It was methodical, that bothered me more than shouting ever could. They weren't improvising, they believed they were in the right, or at least untouchable. That kind of confidence didn't come from confusion. It came from past success, from having pushed people before and watched them fold. I pulled up the county GS map on my laptop and layered it over the survey. The lines matched. The parcel number matched. The acreage matched. Every official record agreed with me, not with a homeowners association board that had decided its authority extended wherever it wanted. The HOA jurisdiction stopped at my legal boundary, and that boundary was exactly where the trees were being marked. I took screenshots. I scanned pages. I photographed the original documents with timestamps visible. I wasn't just preparing to argue. I was preparing to document a pattern, because that's what this was starting to look like. Not a misunderstanding, but a calculated move. When the noise outside finally faded, I waited another 20 minutes before stepping out. The woods looked subtly changed, a few ribbons tied to branches, a couple of fresh paint marks on tree trunks, signs of intent. They hadn't taken anything yet, but they had staked a claim in the most primitive way possible, hoping symbols would become reality if they acted confident enough. I walked the line slowly, phone in hand, recording everything, every ribbon, every mark. Every footprint that crossed from the service road into my land. I didn't narrate. I didn't dramatize. I let the camera capture the quiet arrogance of what they'd done. Evidence didn't need commentary. That evening, the first official notice arrived by email. It was worded carefully, wrapped in bureaucratic language, meant to sound reasonable while hiding its threat. It referenced a boundary adjustment review, and claimed that a portion of my rear acreage fell under common HOA-controlled land. There was no map attached, no citation, just an expectation that I would comply, remove personal items, and cease unauthorized use. The audacity of it would have been impressive if it wasn't so dangerous. They weren't asking, they were asserting, and buried in the language was the implication that enforcement would follow. I didn't respond. Not yet. Silence can be a weapon too, especially when the other side expects fear. Instead, I forwarded the email to my personal archive folder, labeled it carefully, and added notes, date, time, sender. Every detail mattered. That night, I barely slept. Not because I doubted myself, but because I was starting to see the shape of the bigger picture. This HOA president didn't just want control. He wanted expansion. More land meant more power, more leverage, more ability to dictate terms to everyone around him. If he could quietly absorb my acreage, no one else would question the next move. By morning, I had made my decision. This wasn't something to handle internally. HOA thrive in closed systems where intimidation works because no one shines a light on it. I was done playing inside their rules. I made one phone call first. The county recorder's office. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I asked simple questions about boundary disputes and jurisdiction. The woman on the line sounded calm until I mentioned an HOA claiming land beyond recorded parcels. Her tone shifted, not to alarm, but to interest. She told me exactly what I already suspected. HOA had no authority to alter or seize recorded property lines. Any attempt to do so without legal action was not just invalid, but potentially criminal. That word settled heavily in my chest. Criminal. The second call went to the county surveyor. I explained the situation again, carefully, factually. He asked for copies of the documents. I sent them while we were still on the phone. There was a pause as he reviewed them. When he spoke again, his voice was firm. The boundary was correct. The land was mine. Any markings placed by others were unauthorized. I asked him one more question, the one that mattered most. What should I do next? His answer was simple. Document everything. Do not engage directly if intimidation is involved. And if weapons were present, contact law enforcement immediately. That last part confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since I saw the holster. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By mid-afternoon, another email arrived, this one more aggressive. The tone had shifted from polite authority to irritation. It referenced noncompliance and hinted at consequences. Still no map, still no proof, just pressure. I finally replied, briefly and professionally. I stated that my property boundaries were clearly defined by county records, that unauthorized entry and marking had been documented, and that any further trespass would be handled through proper legal channels. I attached nothing. I gave them nothing. Let them wonder how much I knew. The response came faster than expected, short, sharp, dismissive. The HOA president claimed confidence in his position and said the matter would be resolved in person if necessary. That was the moment the threat became undeniable. I forwarded the entire chain to the county surveyor and the recorder's office. Then I backed it up again. Cloud, external drive, redundancy mattered. As evening settled in, a patrol car rolled slowly down the service road behind my property and paused. Just long enough to be seen. Just long enough to send a message. I didn't go outside. I didn't react. I let the cameras record it. The HOA president had tried to seize land with intimidation and confidence, betting I wouldn't push back. He didn't know yet that the maps were already working against him, that every step he took was digging a deeper hole. And the next time he came onto my land, he wouldn't be walking into silence. He would be walking into consequences. By the third day, the pressure stopped pretending to be subtle. The HOA president's confidence had hardened into something reckless, the kind that only shows itself when someone believes the outcome is already decided. Notices arrived faster, each one slightly more aggressive than the last, stacked with legal-sounding phrases designed to overwhelm rather than inform. They reference compliance deadlines, unauthorized occupation, and corrective action, all without a single citation to an actual statute or recorded map. It was intimidation by volume, not validity. What changed that morning was the visit. Not announced, not scheduled, just presence. A cluster of vehicles parked along the service road again, closer this time, angled like they intended to stay. I watched from inside as figures moved in practiced coordination, stepping onto my land as if repetition alone could convert trespass into ownership. The ribbons were still there, the paint marks still fresh, and now there were stakes being pressed into the soil with an enthusiasm that bordered on ceremonial. They were performing authority, rehearsing a future where no one stopped them. I recorded everything without stepping outside. The cameras caught faces, license plates, the precise path of entry. The holster appeared again, unmistakable, riding on a hip that stayed deliberately turned toward the house. It wasn't about protection. It was about suggestion. The suggestion was that resistance would be costly. The suggestion was wrong. While they worked, I worked faster. The county surveyor had emailed confirmation overnight. attaching a certified copy of the boundary overlay with his seal. The jog in the line stood out clearly, the wedge of land highlighted in a way that made the claim against it look absurd. I printed it, scanned it, and archived it twice. Then I sent it to the recorder's office with a request to flag any attempted filings related to my parcel. A quiet alarm, set without theatrics. The HOA president didn't know any of that yet. He didn't know that his actions were being timestamped, categorized, and routed to people whose authority wasn't elective or performative. He believed that proximity equaled power, that standing on land long enough made it his. By noon, the escalation arrived in digital form, a mass email to the neighborhood, carefully worded to poison the well before anyone asked questions. It framed the situation as a dispute caused by a non-compliant homeowner obstructing a planned community improvement. It suggested safety concerns, misuse of land, and an urgent need for HOA intervention. The tone was righteous, the facts vague. It was a preemptive strike on reputation. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't correct the narrative yet. There's a moment in conflicts like this where silence isn't weakness, it's positioning. Let the lie spread, let it pick up witnesses. Let people forward it, comment on it, repeat it. Lies get heavier the more they move, and eventually they collapse under their own weight. The real shift came when a county vehicle appeared on the service road. Unmarked, official in a way that didn't need decoration. The men from earlier stiffened, their movements slowed, the performance lost rhythm. One of them glanced toward the house, another checked a phone. The HOA president stood still, arms crossed, posture rigid with irritation rather than fear. The county official didn't rush. He walked the boundary with the survey in hand, comparing ground to paper with practiced ease. He photographed the markings, the stakes, the ribbons. He noted entry points. He didn't engage, he documented. Documentation is the opposite of intimidation. It doesn't argue, it records. The holstered weapon became a problem in that moment. Not because it was drawn, but because it existed where it didn't belong. The presence shifted the context from civil to concerning. The county official paused near the boundary, wrote something down, and stepped back toward his vehicle. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This had crossed into a category where patience thins quickly. Within an hour, the vehicles left, not triumphantly, not loudly. They peeled away one by one, leaving behind their symbols like a retreating army abandoning flags. The woods went quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This silence felt temporary, brittle, like a held breath. The HOA president didn't concede. He recalibrated. That evening, a new notice arrived claiming emergency authority to secure the disputed land. It cited safety, liability, and imminent action. The language was sharper, the timeline shorter. It was a gamble. He was trying to move faster than the system could respond, to create a fait accompli that would be harder to reverse than to prevent. That was the opening. I forwarded the notice, the video clips, and the county overlay to the sheriff's office, attaching a concise summary with dates and facts. I included the mention of a weapon, the repeated trespass, and the attempt to assert authority beyond recorded boundaries. I didn't accuse, I didn't editorialize, I let the pattern speak. The response came sooner than expected, not dramatic, not emotional, procedural. A deputy would be dispatched to assess. Any further entry without permission would be addressed accordingly. By nightfall, the neighborhood buzzed. Screenshots of the HOA email circulated. Questions surfaced. Why was there no map? Why was a boundary change happening without a vote? Why were there reports of armed presence? The narrative the HOA president had tried to control began slipping through his fingers, replaced by uncertainty and concern. I watched the online threads quietly. I didn't post. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Once doubt enters a controlled environment, it spreads faster than authority can contain. The next morning, the deputy arrived. He walked the line with me, reviewed the documents, and noted the markings. He photographed the stakes and removed the ribbons, placing them into an evidence bag with a methodical calm that felt like relief. He advised me to call immediately if anyone returned. His report would reflect unauthorized entry and intimidation concerns. That report mattered more than any argument. It transformed the situation from a he said into a record. Records don't care about charisma. They care about facts. By afternoon, the HOA president sent a final message demanding a meeting on site to resolve the matter. The tone was clipped, the confidence strained. He wanted proximity again. He wanted to reassert dominance in person. I declined, politely, in writing. I stated that any further communication should be directed through legal counsel, and that any entry onto my property would be considered trespass. I attached the certified boundary overlay this time, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. Silence followed, not the quiet of victory, but the quiet of recalculation. The kind that comes when someone realizes the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they believed. I knew then that the confrontation was entering its most dangerous phase, not because he had more power, but because he had less. People who lose control don't always retreat gracefully. Sometimes they lash out. The maps had exposed the truth. The records had stripped away the performance, and now the HOA president was cornered by paper, procedure, and a spotlight he hadn't planned for. The next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be public, and once it happened, there would be no putting the story back inside the neighborhood's gates. The silence didn't last long, and it never does when someone who thrives on control begins to feel it slipping away. By the fourth day, the HOA president's strategy shifted from quiet pressure to visible force. Not physical force yet, but the kind that relies on spectacle, uniforms, vehicles, and the illusion of legitimacy. It started early, before most of the neighborhood had finished their morning routines, as if timing alone could make the move feel official. I noticed the vehicles first. 2 SUVs parked near the service road, both with HOA decals large enough to be unmistakable. They were positioned carefully, angled so that anyone driving past would assume sanctioned activity. The message wasn't meant for me alone, it was meant for the audience. Authority only works when people are watching and believing. From inside, I monitored the cameras and documented every arrival. The HOA president stepped out last, dressed like he was attending a press conference rather than trespassing on private land. His posture was rigid, jaw tight, the confidence now edged with irritation. He brought more people this time, including a private security contractor, whose presence was clearly intended to blur the line between association rules and actual law enforcement. The contractor wore neutral clothing but carried himself with practiced intimidation, standing slightly forward, making sure his presence was noticed. They crossed the boundary again, no hesitation, no pause. The assumption of ownership had hardened into entitlement. They began placing new markers, this time larger and more visible, as if size could compensate for illegitimacy. One of them unfolded a laminated map and held it up for others to see, pointing dramatically to areas that did not align with any county record. It was theater, bad theater, but dangerous nonetheless. What they didn't realize was that the neighborhood was already watching, and not in the way they wanted. A few residents had gathered at a distance, drawn by the vehicles and the unusual activity. Phones were out. Conversations were low but urgent. The story the HOA president had tried to control was escaping the confines of official emails and becoming something organic, something unpredictable. I made the call immediately. Not in anger, not in fear, calmly with documentation ready. I reported active trespass, previous warnings, and the continued presence of intimidation. I mentioned the security contractor. I mentioned the history. I didn't need to embellish. The facts were heavy enough on their own. While waiting, I continued recording. The HOA president paced near the boundary line, occasionally gesturing toward my house as if daring me to come out. I didn't. Power struggles often depend on reaction. Denying it starves the performance. The first patrol car arrived quietly, without sirens. The effect was immediate. The group stiffened again, movements slowing, voices lowering. The HOA president stepped forward, ready with his narrative, his laminated map held like a shield. He was prepared to explain, to dominate the interaction, to assert that this was all procedural. The deputy didn't rush. He listened, nodded once, and then asked for documentation. Not opinions, not interpretations. documentation. The laminated map was examined briefly and set aside. The deputy asked for county records. None were produced. The certified overlay, the survey, the deed, all of those existed only in my possession and in county files. The security contractor suddenly had nowhere to stand comfortably. His presence, once meant to intimidate, now looked excessive. The deputy took note of him, his posture shifting subtly to one of assessment. This wasn't a routine HOA matter anymore. It was a repeated violation with witnesses. The HOA president's composure cracked just enough to be visible. His gestures became sharper, his pacing tighter. Authority doesn't unravel all at once. It frays at the edges first. The deputy walked the boundary again, comparing the visible markers to the recorded line. He photographed everything. He asked who placed the stakes. The answer was hesitant. Responsibility became diffuse. No one wanted to own the action now that consequences were present. The order came quietly but firmly. All unauthorized markers were to be removed immediately. Any further entry would result in citations. The security contractor was instructed to leave. The HOA president protested, citing internal authority, community interest, future plans. None of it mattered. Internal authority ends where property rights begin. The removal was awkward, almost humiliating. Stakes were pulled from the ground under watchful eyes. Ribbons were untied. The performance unraveled in reverse, each gesture undoing what had been so confidently done days earlier. Residents watched from a distance, recording, whispering, reassessing everything they thought they knew about who really held power in their neighborhood. As the vehicles departed, the HOA president lingered for a moment near the service road, staring back toward the trees as if willing them to move. They didn't. Land doesn't respond to ego. That afternoon, the HOA official communication channels went silent. No emails, no notices, no updates. The board members who had once spoken so confidently now avoided the subject entirely. Silence returned, but this time it felt different. It felt like retreat. Privately, messages started arriving from neighbors. Quiet questions, apologies disguised as curiosity, admissions of similar experiences, smaller ones, brushed off until now. The pattern was emerging. The HOA president hadn't just overreached with me. He had been testing boundaries for years, pushing until someone finally pushed back with proof instead of fear. By evening, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood. A short clip from someone's phone made its way onto a local community page. It showed the patrol car, the markers being removed, the HOA president standing stiffly to the side. No narration, no context, just images. Images are dangerous to people who rely on controlled narratives. I knew then that the situation was no longer just about my land. It had become a referendum on power, on how easily authority can slide into abuse when no one challenges it. The maps had started it. The records had reinforced it. But now the spotlight was doing its work, and the HOA president, for the first time since this began, was reacting instead of directing. That was the sign. The next phase wouldn't be fought in the woods or on the service road. It would unfold in meeting rooms, inboxes, and public forums where confidence meant nothing without truth to support it. The HOA could no longer pretend nothing had happened, and pretending had always been its greatest skill. When the emergency meeting notice finally went out, it arrived wrapped in neutrality, stripped of emotion, framed as routine governance. The timing alone revealed the truth. Associations don't call emergency meetings unless control is slipping. The agenda was vague, the language carefully sanitized, but everyone knew why it was happening. The land dispute had escaped containment. The meeting room was full before it officially started. Faces I had only ever seen behind steering wheels or curtains were now gathered in one place, alert and uneasy. This wasn't a social event or a casual update. It felt like a reckoning waiting for a cue. The board members sat together at the front, their posture defensive rather than authoritative. The HOA president occupied the center seat, his expression tight, his confidence now brittle instead of commanding. I didn't sit up front. I didn't need to. I chose a seat near the back where I could observe without becoming the spectacle. The cameras did that job for me. Several residents had already set up phones, openly recording, no longer worried about the unspoken rules against documenting HOA business. Once people stop fearing consequences, power changes hands quickly. The meeting opened with formalities, minutes, motions, all the rituals meant to re-establish order, but the room wasn't interested. The tension sat heavy, pressing forward, demanding acknowledgement. When the agenda finally reached the item labeled as a property boundary clarification, the air shifted. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The HOA president spoke first, as expected. He framed the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a proactive effort to protect community interests, a process interrupted by unnecessary escalation. The words flowed smoothly, practiced and rehearsed, but they no longer carried weight. Too many people had seen too much. What followed was not a debate, because debates require two equal stories. This was an exposure. Certified documents were requested and produced. The county overlay was displayed. The survey lines were shown clearly, undeniably. The jog in the boundary that had once been dismissed as inconvenient now sat illuminated for everyone to see. The room reacted not with outrage, but with clarity. Confusion melted away. The map did what no argument could. It simplified everything. The land was never ambiguous. The claim had never been valid. The intimidation had never been justified. Questions came next, not from me, but from neighbors. Why had no vote been held? Why was private security involved? Why were weapons present? Each question peeled back another layer of the performance. The HOA president's responses grew shorter, less certain. Authority doesn't like cross-examination. When the footage surfaced, the meeting crossed a threshold. Clips played, showing the markers being placed, the security contractor standing watch, the patrol car arriving, the markers being removed. No commentary, no editing, just sequence, time and cause laid out plainly. The room changed sides without a formal vote. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward, in the way board members avoided eye contact, in the way the president's posture collapsed inward, shoulders no longer squared. A motion was introduced to suspend any action related to the disputed land pending independent review. It passed quickly. Another motion followed, calling for an internal ethics review regarding unauthorized actions taken by the president. That passed too. Each vote chipped away at the image he had built over years. I didn't speak until the end, and when I did, it was brief. I stated the facts, referenced the records, and made one thing clear: the issue was never personal. It was about boundaries, literal and otherwise. Rights don't disappear because someone wants them to. Silence followed, not hostile, but reflective. By the time the meeting adjourned, the story had fully escaped. Residents clustered in small groups, comparing notes, sharing experiences, connecting dots. The HOA president left quickly, avoiding conversation, his authority now a question mark instead of a given. Outside, phones buzzed as clips and screenshots spread beyond the room. The narrative was no longer controlled by letterhead or bylaws. It was being told by witnesses, by maps, by evidence. That night, messages arrived from outside the community. Friends of residents, local groups, people who recognized the pattern because they had lived it elsewhere. The story resonated because it wasn't unique, just rarely documented so clearly. The land was secure now in every legal sense, but the conflict wasn't over. Exposure has consequences, and people who lose power don't always accept it quietly. As I organized the files one last time before bed, I understood the shift. The HOA president had tried to seize land at gunpoint, and the maps had exposed everything, but the real damage was no longer about acreage. It was about trust, and that was something no board could redraw with a vote. The next chapter wouldn't be about proving ownership. That part was done. It would be about fallout. The days after the meeting felt unreal, like the moment after a storm when everything looks familiar, but nothing is quite the same. The neighborhood still had its manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations that once happened in whispers now unfolded openly. People stood in driveways longer than usual, phones in hand, exchanging information instead of small talk. Control thrives on isolation, and that isolation had been broken. The HOA president vanished from public view almost immediately. His name remained on emails and documents, but his presence did not. No drive, by inspections, no sudden notices, no authoritative strolls meant to remind everyone who was in charge. Absence became its own message. When someone who has relied on visibility disappears, it's rarely by choice. The board tried to stabilize the situation the only way it knew how, with statements. Carefully worded updates arrived claiming transparency, accountability, and a commitment to review procedures. The tone was conciliatory, almost apologetic, a sharp contrast to the confidence that had defined the association for years. They promised independent assessments, legal consultation, and a pause on all enforcement actions related to property boundaries. It sounded responsible, but it also sounded like damage control. What they couldn't control was the spread. Short clip from the service road, multiplied across platforms, reposted with captions that stripped away the HOA preferred language and replaced it with blunt clarity. People recognized the pattern instantly. Overreach, intimidation, abuse of authority. The details mattered less than the structure of the story, and the structure was familiar to anyone who had ever dealt with unchecked power in a small system. Messages poured in from outside the neighborhood. Some were supportive, some were cautionary, others shared eerily similar experiences. HOA boards claiming land, issuing threats, relying on residents' fear of legal complexity to get their way. The difference here was proof, maps, records, footage, the things that turn anecdotes into evidence. Inside the community, the ripple effects intensified. Board members who had once aligned themselves closely with the president began distancing themselves. Statements shifted from we to he. Responsibility fragmented. No one wanted to be associated with the decisions now under scrutiny. Power structures unravel quietly, with people stepping backward one at a time, pretending they were never fully involved. The county's response followed predictably but firmly. A formal notice was issued clarifying jurisdictional boundaries and explicitly stating that the HOA had no authority over the disputed land. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Official letters don't raise their voices. They simply exist, heavy with finality. That notice did something important. It closed the door on reinterpretation. The HOA president could no longer claim confusion or competing opinions. The matter was settled in black and white. Any further attempt to assert control would no longer be misguided. It would be willful. Legal counsel entered the picture next, not mine at first, but theirs. The association's tone shifted again, this time to cautious restraint. Communication slowed. Language softened further. Every word was now filtered through risk assessment. When lawyers appear, bravado usually disappears. Neighbors began requesting records, minutes, and financial statements. Once people realize access is possible, they start asking for it. Transparency became a demand, not a slogan. Questions about past decisions surfaced. Small fines, selective enforcement, patterns that had been tolerated because they were isolated now lined up into something harder to ignore. The HOA president's resignation arrived without ceremony. A brief notice, citing personal reasons and a desire to avoid further distraction. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just an attempt to exit quietly before consequences could catch up. It didn't work. Resignation doesn't erase history. The security contractor was the next thread to unravel. Reports questioned why private security had been engaged at all, and under whose authority. The contractor distanced himself quickly, issuing a statement that his role was limited and based on information provided to him. Another step back. Another layer shedding responsibility. I stayed quiet through most of it. There was nothing to add. The facts were already doing their work. When you let documentation speak, it doesn't get tired, emotional, or inconsistent. It just keeps being true. The neighborhood began to reevaluate itself. Informal meetings formed, new committees were proposed. People who had never considered running for the board before suddenly did. Fear had been replaced with possibility, and that was more disruptive to the old order than any single conflict. Late one evening, as I walked the boundary line one last time, I noticed something small but telling. The paint marks were gone. The ground where the stakes had been pulled was settling back into place. The land was quiet again, not because it was subdued, but because it was respected. The story was still spreading, still evolving, but its core had stabilized. A land grab backed by intimidation had failed, not because of shouting or threats, but because of preparation and persistence. Yet I knew the fallout wasn't finished. Systems don't change overnight. They resist, they adapt, and sometimes they push back when they feel cornered. The next chapter wouldn't be about headlines or meetings. It would be about what happens when people realize they can challenge power, and what power does when it's no longer protected by silence. With the HOA president gone, many people expected an immediate sense of relief, as if removing one figure would restore normalcy. It didn't. What settled over the neighborhood instead was a quiet unease, the kind that comes after realizing how close something came to going very wrong. Power, even when it fails, leaves impressions behind. Habits formed under pressure don't disappear the moment the pressure lifts. The interim board moved quickly to project stability. Temporary leadership was announced, committees were formed, and a review process was promised for nearly every major decision made in the past few years. The language was careful and conciliatory, but beneath it was a shared understanding that trust had been broken. Rebuilding it would take more than new names on letterhead. Residents began talking openly about experiences they had once dismissed as isolated incidents. Selective enforcement, threatening letters over minor issues, sudden rule interpretations that seemed to change depending on who was involved. On their own, each story sounded small. Together, they formed a pattern that felt disturbingly intentional. The land dispute had become a lens through which everything else was being re-examined. Requests for records multiplied. Financial disclosures were scrutinized. Contracts were reviewed line by line. The association discovered that transparency, once demanded, is difficult to contain. Every document raised new questions. Every answer led to another inquiry. The board's inbox filled faster than it could respond, not with hostility, but with persistence. The county's involvement continued quietly in the background. Follow-up inspections confirmed that no further boundary violations had occurred. Notes were added to files. Flags remained in place, unseen but active, ensuring that any future attempt to revisit the issue would trigger immediate attention. Bureaucracy, when aligned with justice, becomes a powerful deterrent. For me, the conflict had changed the meaning of ownership. The land had always been mine on paper, but now it felt earned in a different way. I had defended it not with force, but with patience and preparation. Walking the boundary no longer felt like guarding territory. It felt like closure. Still, the emotional residue lingered. Knowing that intimidation had been considered acceptable by people tasked with community management left a mark. It forced an uncomfortable awareness of how easily systems designed for order can be twisted into tools of coercion. The uniform lawns and matching fences now carried a different symbolism. They weren't just aesthetic choices. They were reminders of conformity enforced without question. The broader community continued to react. Online discussions expanded, drawing in legal professionals, surveyors, and former board members from other associations. The story became an example rather than an anomaly. People dissected it not for entertainment alone, but for instruction. What to document, who to call, when to stay silent, when to escalate. That educational aspect proved more unsettling to those who preferred quiet control than any accusation ever could. Knowledge spreads quickly once fear no longer blocks it. Within the neighborhood, the cultural shift was unmistakable. Residents who had once avoided eye contact now exchanged knowing looks. The unspoken agreement to look away had been broken. Community events resumed, but with a different energy. Conversations were longer, more candid. People asked questions they had never felt entitled to ask before. The interim board announced proposed bylaw revisions, including clearer limits on enforcement authority and explicit prohibitions against engaging armed security for civil matters. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rules had to be rewritten to prevent the abuse of rules. Privately, I received one message that stood out. It came from someone who had served on the board years earlier and stepped down quietly after clashing with the former president. They didn't offer praise or sympathy, they offered confirmation. The behavior I had documented wasn't new. It had simply gone unchallenged for too long. That realization was sobering. It meant the incident wasn't an outlier. It was a culmination. The land itself remained unchanged, indifferent to human drama. Trees continued to grow. The service road carried on. Nature, unlike authority, doesn't overreach. It occupies only what it can sustain. As weeks passed, the attention began to settle. New stories emerged elsewhere. Algorithms moved on, but inside the neighborhood the effects remained. Structures had shifted. Assumptions had been dismantled. I understood then that victory in conflicts like this isn't loud or cinematic. It's quiet and lasting. It shows up in small freedoms returning, in the absence of fear, in the confidence to ask for proof instead of permission. The HOA president's attempt to seize land had failed spectacularly, but the deeper lesson was still unfolding. The next chapter wouldn't focus on the association at all. It would focus on what comes after people realize they can protect themselves, and how that realization reshapes a place meant to feel like home. Change didn't arrive with celebration or announcements. It seeped in slowly, almost cautiously, as if the neighborhood itself was unsure whether it was allowed to relax. Rules still existed, dues were still paid, lawns were still trimmed, but the feeling underneath it all had softened. The tension that once hovered in every interaction began to dissolve, replaced by something unfamiliar yet welcome: ease. The interim board's presence became less about oversight and more about listening. Open forums replaced closed sessions. Meeting minutes were distributed without delay. Financial summaries were explained instead of buried. None of it was revolutionary, but the consistency mattered. Transparency, when practiced regularly, becomes routine instead of performative. Residents who had once kept their distance from association matters began attending meetings, not to argue, but to understand. The conversation shifted from compliance to collaboration. Suggestions replaced demands. Questions were met with answers instead of deflection. It was a subtle recalibration, but one that changed the tone of the entire community. The land behind my house returned to being just land, no markers, no ribbons, no strangers wandering through with clipboards and authority. The absence of intrusion was noticeable precisely because it had once been constant. Peace, I learned, isn't loud. It's the lack of interruption. Outside the neighborhood, the story continued to ripple. The footage and documentation were now being used as reference material in discussions about HOA reform. Lawyers cited it, advocates shared it. People who felt trapped in similar situations saw a path forward that didn't involve escalation or fear. The story had outgrown its origin, becoming a cautionary tale with practical lessons. That wider impact brought a strange sense of responsibility. I hadn't set out to expose anything beyond a land grab, but once the truth was visible, it carried weight. People reached out asking for advice, not legal strategy, but mindset. How to stay calm, how to document, how to resist intimidation without becoming consumed by it. The answer was always the same: preparation over confrontation, records over rhetoric, patience over panic. Power feeds on reaction, and starving it is often the most effective response. Within the community, new leadership elections were scheduled. For the first time in years, there were more candidates than positions. Platforms focused on service rather than enforcement. The idea that the HOA existed to support property owners instead of policing them began to take hold. Walking through the neighborhood now felt different. Smiles lingered longer. Conversations felt unguarded. The invisible line between neighbors had faded. People no longer scanned for violations in each other's yards. They talked about plans, improvements, shared concerns. It felt, finally, like a community instead of a checklist. The bylaw revisions passed with overwhelming support. Clear limits were set. Oversight mechanisms were established. The association's power was defined, constrained, and transparent. Authority, when bounded, becomes far less dangerous. On my end, life returned to normal routines. The workshop plans resumed. The garden space took shape. The land became productive again, not just legally mine, but emotionally reclaimed. Each small project felt like a quiet assertion of autonomy, a reminder that ownership is as much about security as it is about space. Occasionally, I would think back to that first moment in the woods, the sight of strangers marking trees as if they had already won. The memory no longer triggered anger or fear. It served as contrast, a reminder of how quickly things can shift when evidence meets persistence. The former HOA president remained absent, his name now a footnote in meeting minutes and conversations. Power had moved on without him, redistributed among people who understood its limits. That absence was its own conclusion. The neighborhood had learned something essential. Rules require accountability. Authority requires oversight, and silence, once broken, can't easily be restored. As the story's intensity faded, its lessons remained embedded in daily life. The community breathed easier not because it was perfect, but because it was awake. The next chapter would close the circle, not with conflict, but with reflection, on what it means to stand your ground without losing yourself, and how one boundary dispute reshaped an entire place. By the time the attention faded, what remained was not triumph, but something heavier and more instructive. Victory, when it comes without shouting, has a way of settling into the bones instead of the bloodstream. The neighborhood no longer buzzed with speculation or tension, but the memory of what had happened lingered in subtle ways, shaping decisions, slowing reactions, encouraging caution where there had once been blind trust. I found myself reflecting often on how close the situation had come to spiraling in a very different direction. If intimidation had worked even briefly, if fear had overridden preparation, the outcome would have been rewritten quietly and permanently. Land would have been lost not through law, but through pressure. And no one would have questioned it, because the loss would have looked procedural instead of predatory. That realization reframed everything. The incident was never just about acreage. It was about how systems depend on compliance more than consent, and how easily authority can expand when no one challenges its assumptions. The HOA president hadn't invented that dynamic. He had simply exploited it. Life settled into a rhythm again. The days grew ordinary in the best possible way. Work resumed. Projects progressed. The land behind the house became a place of purpose rather than conflict. Each time I walked its boundary, there was no longer a sense of vigilance. There was understanding. The line existed not as a barrier, but as a definition. Neighbors continued to change too, though less visibly. People asked questions now before agreeing. They read notices instead of skimming them. Meetings became places of participation instead of performance. The community had learned skepticism, not as hostility, but as responsibility. Occasionally, new residents would move in, unaware of what had happened before them. They saw only the calm surface, the neat lawns, the friendly exchanges, and that was fine. A community doesn't need to live in its scars. It only needs to remember how they were earned. The broader impact remained the most unexpected part. Messages still arrived from time to time, months later, from people facing similar struggles elsewhere. They didn't ask for legal help, they asked for reassurance, proof that standing firm didn't require becoming aggressive or bitter, proof that patience could outlast pressure. I always told them the same thing. Document everything, trust facts more than personalities, and never assume authority is legitimate just because it sounds confident. Confidence without foundation is the easiest thing to dismantle. The former HOA president's name surfaced once more, briefly, in a conversation about governance changes. There was no anger attached to it anymore, just context. He had become an example rather than a threat. History has a way of reducing overreach to cautionary reference. As seasons changed, the land changed with them. Leaves fell where ribbons once hung. Snow covered ground that had been marked for seizure. Growth replaced disturbance. Nature erased the evidence faster than memory ever could. What stayed with me most was the understanding that boundaries matter far beyond property lines. They exist in governance, in relationships, in expectations. When those boundaries are respected, communities function. When they aren't, damage spreads quickly and quietly. The story, for most people, had already ended. They had seen the clips, read the summaries, moved on. But for those of us who lived through it, the ending was still forming, not as an event, but as a mindset. The final chapter wouldn't be about what was taken or saved. It would be about what was learned, and why that lesson would outlast any HOA president, any meeting, any attempt to claim power that didn't belong to them. In the end, the maps were never just pieces of paper. They were witnesses, silent, precise, indifferent to confidence or intimidation. They existed long before the HOA president imagined expanding his reach, and they would remain long after his name faded from relevance. What they revealed wasn't just a boundary, but a truth about how power works when it's challenged by facts instead of fear. The attempt to seize land at gunpoint had failed because it relied on the wrong assumptions. It assumed intimidation would outweigh preparation. It assumed silence meant agreement. It assumed that authority, once asserted loudly enough, would become reality. Each of those assumptions collapsed the moment evidence entered the room. The story's real turning point wasn't the patrol car, the meeting, or the resignation. It was the decision to trust records over reaction, to slow down when pressure demanded speed, to respond with documentation when threatened with force. That choice reshaped everything that followed. The neighborhood carried on, altered in ways that weren't immediately visible but deeply felt. Governance became cautious instead of aggressive. Participation replaced apathy. People learned that rules could be questioned without chaos, and that order didn't require submission. The association became smaller in spirit, less intrusive, more clearly defined. For me, the land became a symbol rather than a prize. It represented the space people are entitled to occupy without permission, the rights that don't disappear simply because someone decides they're inconvenient. Standing on it no longer felt like defiance. It felt like alignment, with law, with patience, with principle. The former HOA president's legacy wasn't the authority he wielded, but the lesson he left behind. Overreach creates resistance. Control invites scrutiny. And power exercised without accountability eventually exposes itself. What lingered most was the understanding that these stories don't end with villains defeated or heroes celebrated. They end with systems corrected and people changed. Quietly, permanently, the maps exposed everything, but only because someone was willing to look at them, trust them, and let them speak. That willingness turned a private intimidation into a public reckoning, and a land grab into a reminder. Boundaries exist for a reason. When they're respected, communities breathe. When they're ignored, truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how much authority stands in its way. And long after the emails stop, the meetings end, and the story fades from public attention, the land remains, exactly where it has always been, unmoved by threats, unchanged by arrogance, quietly proving that facts outlast fear.